All right. So that's shaping conduct. You get people to go after something else or to misunderstand the situation and pursue the situation according to the wrong schema. How do you expand the OODA loop? Basically, you just slow them down. You introduce ambiguity. How do you introduce ambiguity? Suppose you're a defense counsel. You want a little more time to interview the witnesses. I know there's no defense counsel in here, but someday some of you will be defense counsel. You want to slow down the government. You don't want them to start talking to the witnesses, getting statements, getting things arranged. So you tell them, you know, what kind of deal do you want? All right, we'll get you a deal next week. And meanwhile, you go out and you start interviewing all the witnesses and getting everything locked down and get all the good stuff together. But you've introduced ambiguity by suggesting one thing's going to happen, even though the other side probably thinks something else. It's called a pooling equilibrium. How else do you slow them down? Basically, you can also try and induce them towards analysis paralysis by just feeding them other information. I don't have much time to expand on that, but again, it's free. I've left it. This will be up free till Saturday. Strategy planning and litigating to win. It's got everything I'm talking about plus more. Let's talk about disruption and overload. This is what's commonly associated with the OODA loop. If you've heard about the OODA loop, you probably heard about it in this context. The whole framework is basically what you see on the right-hand side of the screen there. What's happening is people are going through their OODA loop. They're thinking, all right, here's what's going on, here's what I'm going to do about it. But then all of a sudden, you, or they do this to you, they introduce some new fact. And it's like, ooh, I was going to do that, but now I need to reorient on this new fact. So things start happening that you have to reconsider the situation. You don't get to the all necessary act phase because you're just trying to reorient. And gradually you fall farther and farther behind where you're barely having time to enter the orientation phase before something new's happening, and they're just dominating the battle space, and you are trying to respond. What that eventually leads to is complete breakdown. All right, take for example what we saw happen to the defense counsel. The defense counsel was sitting at the table, minding their own business, just waiting to attack the victim's credibility, and all of a sudden they have this issue with, they're undermining the theory of credibility. And then, wait a second, what about this back door? Can I attack the back door? So they start one OODA loop, they don't finish it, and then they have to start another one. And then as they're going through that loop, they're thinking, oh my gosh, this is premeditation. This is an entirely different theory of the case. They're on OODA loop number 3. They haven't accomplished anything. At a certain point, once these things stack up, different people have different tolerances for ambiguity and unresolved things in their life. At a certain point, though, everyone is either going to get to a point where they're like, all right, I'm done. I can't deal with this. And they just kind of back off, shut down, lower the doors on the bunker and hope for the best. Or they lash out blindly. They just start doing random things, like, let's invade Fallujah again. So the point is, what happens is, by being able to get to the act phase faster, you are forcing them to have to reconsider the situation. And the more you are getting to the act phase, you are seizing the initiative, you're taking control of the action, and you're adjusting the situation the way you want, and they first are just in a response mode, and then they're in a completely ineffective mode. And that's what's most commonly associated with the OODA loop, but there's other toys you can play with the OODA loop as well. All right, so what does this boil down to? Friction can gum up the other guy's OODA loop or your OODA loop through these means. How do you protect against that? All right, everyone gets lucky. Even if you haven't studied strategy, you've probably seen some of these kinds of things happen. What do? You need to make your OODA loop nice and tight. You need to make it really compact so that you're zipping through as fast as possible and taking actions, continually giving them more stuff to think about, and continuing to shape the situation the way you need it to be shaped. How do you do that? Planning. You got to predict and preferably validate your actions. You do that ahead of time so you're not confined by bounded rationality. By having a limited amount of time, you take your time ahead of time. And by adaptation, not everything's going to go your way, so you make yourself adaptable and flexible. You maintain situational awareness, and by understanding the system and the situation, you can make better decisions on the fly. Obviously, when you don't have information, you can't observe and properly orient. Let's go in a little more depth. Prediction, as I said, is going through part of the loop ahead of time. You think about, all right, what could happen? What are they likely to do? You orient ahead of time. You decide ahead of time. And then when it actually happens, when you're in the clutch, something happens, all you have to do is observe. Aha! You orient to the extent of, I knew they were going to do that. And then you act. And boom, you've got a nice tight OODA loop. It's basically observe, act, observe, act. You're totally on top of the situation. How do you predict things? There's an entire field of game theory, which is subordinate to utility theory, which deals with how you can mathematically predict the way things are going to play out. What it's basically relying on, though, is the theory of utility. People do things because they benefit them. So if you know what their purpose is, what's their agenda, what are they trying to achieve? All right, if I was trying to achieve that, what would I do? And you just kind of play it out from there. So it's really just understanding what would a rational person do in that situation. And you play things out. And if you get to a point where I'm not sure what they do, then you do a branch plan. If they do this, I'm going to do that. If they do this other thing, I'll go off on my branch plan. What messes up your predictions? Well, first, there's bounded rationality. They're going to make mistakes. Second, your fleeting goals. We talked about Jack Nicholson's competing goals. Sometimes people introduce competing goals. I've seen a lot of trials where they throw in a red herring, and all of a sudden one counselor or the other thinks, oh, I need to start attacking this issue, but that issue isn't even central to their plan. And if these people actually had a plan and identified what they were all about, they know that's a red herring, I can leave that alone, let it go. And third, deviousness and adaptability. These people, they're not on your side, they're going to try and trick you, so they're going to try and not be predictable. Again, you get around that by having a good effective plan, knowing what's relevant, what's not, and by viewing things through the lens of, all right, here's what they're probably trying to achieve. How do we become flexible? We maintain the maximum amount of freedom of action. You choose courses of action that give you the most options coming out of them. You can't leave all your doors open because then you wind up with an economy of force issue. You can't be everywhere at once. You have to pick a main effort, something I don't have time to get into. But you pick what's important to me, and you follow those things. And the things you make important to you are the things that give you the most freedom of action. I'll give you an example shortly. Second, you have clear guideposts along the way. So you know my plan could come off the rails at any given point. There's things that will blindside me at some point. But what do you do if you're driving down the highway? We're in Central Texas. Everything's flat. There's not too many trees. You miss your exit, but there's a water tower right next to where you're trying to go. You just get off of the next exit, and you just kind of dead reckon until you get near that water tower. If you have guideposts like that in your plan, something goes wrong, it's like, all right, I just got to kind of get events back here. You're very flexible, and you know exactly where you're going at any point. You don't have to reorient on the whole situation because you've got a guidepost. These guideposts come in the line of operations concept, which I'll introduce to you right now. The components I suggest, you won't find all this stuff in 3-24. The underlying concept is in 3-24. There's just the counterinsurgency manual, but I've added a couple things based on the way the whole effects-based operation theory is played out. And you'll see why in a second. But basically it starts with tactical action. Again, you got to know your trial practice, you got to know the basics of rule of law. Captain LeBoon covered a lot of that last week. Your tactical actions are going to have effects. Remember we had that big grid of variables, your landscape. You're able to change things on that landscape. There are things that are completely within your control. And you know that by affecting those variables, you're going to have impact on these other variables. So the effects are the things you control. The things you don't control, we're calling aims. You'll see why we differentiate them to an extent shortly, but there's deeper reasons why as well. Now, the aims are basically the things you need to set up, the variables you need to twist in a certain way to achieve your purpose. Your purpose, as I said at the beginning, is the criteria of success. What are the metrics of this equals a win for me? Everyone's obeying the law, or crime is down to one criminal per 100,000 citizens or whatever in rule of law, or my convening authority has whatever level of success. You got to have your metrics. That's your clear purpose. Given that clear purpose, you then say, all right, what are my aims? What are the variables that I shift that result in that? And then what effects can I have that make those variables reality? Here's a quick example, because I know that was clear as mud, but hopefully it laid the groundwork. All right, you're a defense counsel. Your goal is, I want my defendant free and clear. How can I get there? Well, one way I can do that, leaving a lot of freedom of action, is if I can get the charges dismissed. Why is there a lot of freedom of action with that? Well, if I can't get the charges dismissed, I can still go ahead and I can move for dismissal on the close of the government's case. I can get a jury acquittal. I can go for the appeals. So my goal is going to be, I'm going to get the charges dismissed. What variables need to change for that to happen? Well, if I get the evidence suppressed, that's going to pretty much likely result in the charges getting dismissed. How do I do that? I make a motion to suppress. Making a motion to suppress relies on your tactical knowledge of how do I research and draft a motion, and how do I argue a motion. Don't recommend sticking those in the line of operations, because as you'll see, these things get kind of complex. Keep it as tight as possible. All right, I do not have time to talk more about construction. I did do another 1-hour presentation at the JAG school prior to doing my thesis. And it's available here. It's about 50% overlap with what we're covering today, but it goes a lot deeper into building the line of operations. It also covers the concepts of main effort, and there's a couple other things you can pick up. You've got the link in your handouts. All right, after you build your line of operations, you want to validate it. This is where you sit down, and if your placard looks like the underpants gnomes with the big question mark in the middle, it's not a valid plan. If you can sit down and say, all right, this is likely to result in that, which is likely to result in that. If I achieve all these aims, I'm probably going to achieve my purpose. Then you've got a valid plan. This eye chart here is how to do with game theory. If any of you majored in game theory, go ahead, use game theory. But by and large, you can generally eyeball these things and say, all right, yeah, I think there's a pretty fair chance that this is going to play out this way. And if it doesn't play out that way, I've got a branch plan ready so I can get around these things. Which brings us to the second point. Validation is what you do right after planning. After or while you're planning your lines of operation, your lines of effort, you say, all right, yeah, this looks good. After you're done, you actually got to carry that thing out, or someone's going to have to carry it out. You want to, this is doctrine, measures of performance, measures of effectiveness. Your measure of performance asks the question, did I accomplish what I set out to do? That goes directly to effects. I wanted to make a motion. Did the judge actually consider the motion? If not, then I go ahead and I make sure that effect is correctly enacted. Hey judge, could you actually consider my motion? If you go ahead and make it, and it didn't happen, you got to ask, did the effect achieve the aim? I thought this would result in shifting that variable. It didn't happen. All right. Then you got to do something different. People don't laugh at the joke. You don't keep repeating the punchline. You come up with a new joke. You do something different. So how does this play out? If my motion doesn't work, all right, I thought I was going to have a good motion. Turns out the case law doesn't support it. It wasn't an illegal search. Well, I can still argue, maybe it's not relevant, or 413, or something else. And maybe I can get the judge to just say, no, that stuff's not coming in. Suppose that doesn't work. I go to my next step. All right, what else can I do to get the charges dismissed? I try that. Suppose none of that works. We go to the next step. What's the next thing I can do? Well, we go for the some other dude did it defense, and how we're going to do that, we're going to discredit some witnesses. So what you're doing is you're surgically removing the smallest piece possible. Now that might look like, oh, that's a lot of work. Why do I want to bother? You want to bother because when you get to a case, this is like the treetop or the mountaintop view of the trial from the case study. And now just this little bottom segment of the line of effort actually laid out looked like that. So you want to know that if this one little piece falls out, if my 412 motion doesn't work, where can I plug back into this plan? This is my roadmap. This is how I get back to my destination after I miss my exit. I don't abandon the whole plan. I don't do a whole new situation analysis. I say, all right, how do I get back to this next point? This thing didn't work. I'm going to the next point. You've got a very flexible, you can adapt rapidly as the situation goes south, and you take control of the situation, you hold the initiative to dominate. And that's it. And we did pretty good for time. So what does this all add up to? Number one, you're going to encounter problems. Problems are going to come from other people, from information, and from the situation. The solution is you plan. You predict ahead of time, then you validate your plan. You make sure you don't have any big question marks, that you're not making ridiculous assumptions like, I think the entire army's probably going to surrender to us, and there probably won't be any brigandage afterwards. There's not going to be robbers running around just because there's no police or government. You validate your plan. Then you adapt. You do that by maintaining situational awareness. You collect as many facts as you can, but not engaging in analysis paralysis, but making sure that you're paying attention to what's happening. You understand your system. You understand how everything interconnects. And you maintain flexibility by choosing courses of action that maintain the greatest freedom of action, and loose coupling, which I didn't really define, but that's basically having these plans where you can kind of plug and play, where you maintain adaptability. I suggest doing that with the line of operations construct. All right. In conclusion, again, this is not, at this point, you might have a couple things you want to try when you're doing your trials or when you're doing rule of law planning. Highly recommend it, but I think you're probably going to need to reference something, and it doesn't have to be this thing I gave you. If you find other stuff, you might start with Sun Tzu's Art of War, Marine Corps Doctrinal Publication 1, Warfighting. There's a lot of good references out there that kind of tell you more about how to be better at achieving what you're trying to achieve. The book is free through Saturday. I already have some videos posted on YouTube. This video is going to get posted on YouTube. If you search 5 Minutes on Strategy, there's a bunch of videos there. I got a blog that I just started with a couple entries, and the videos are also linked to that. You can go there. I do have a request for you. I'm trying to build out training materials. To the extent you've been in the courtroom, if you've seen someone, hey, I did this really smart thing, or someone else did this really cool thing, we can wipe out the names, and it will give me more material to use when I'm trying to clarify these things. I know, half of you are like, what the heck's he talking about? If I had better examples, I could kind of validate a lot of this stuff quicker. Plus, we do brown bag lunches in ad law, which anyone is invited to every Thursday from noon to 1300. We do a brown bag, and we either break down a military problem or a trial strategy problem. So that's good practice if you want to start using this stuff. If you have any questions, or if you got any stories, just come up and see me personally over in the ad law office, or you can email me. At this point, you can kill the video, and does anyone have any questions?